Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. Felipe left off that he is also on this paper. So this is joint work with Felipe in the economics department and also Lisa Hakame at Northwestern. And so the question in this paper is related to the impact of immigration enforcement and the enforcement of immigration laws in the United States on crime or public safety. Let's see, this is not working. That's okay.
It doesn't have to click on the- Yeah, click on the screen with the.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so as a disclaimer before we start, this work uses restricted census data, and none of the opinions that or results that I present today are reflective of the census's views, and the work is supported by the Luskin Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. Okay, so while this paper is about immigration enforcement, I want to start off by just noting that the debates about immigration enforcement and immigration as a policy topic, they often center around the impacts of immigration on crime. And so survey evidence shows this pretty starkly. So this is recent survey evidence from Gallup in the US. And it shows that the share of Americans who believe that immigration makes the following situations worse. Well, the leading concern that Americans have is about crime and immigration. And that is stronger than about job opportunities or the economy. There is a large literature that examines the link between immigration or migration flows and crime, and much of that evidence is mixed and finds null impacts. But nevertheless, proponents of immigration enforcement policy often believe and are motivated in their support of immigration enforcement by the potential for immigration enforcement to improve public safety. Okay, and then this also aligns with the goals of immigration enforcement agencies in the US. So if you look at the ICE mission statement, it says to protect America through criminal investigations and enforcing immigration laws to preserve national security and public safety. That's their explicit goal. And the US spends a lot of money on enforcement, both at the border, which we hear about all the time in the news, but also in the interior of the country. And this is enforcing immigration laws within the borders. The way that interior enforcement works, which I'll talk about later on in the talk, is it flows through local police. So people are referred to ICE through the local jail systems. And roughly half of deported immigrants had prior criminal convictions. And this sort of shows that the way that most deportations happen through interior enforcement is through the jail system. So how does immigration enforcement impact public safety? Well, there's sort of two ways this could go. And it's this is an empirical question because it's not clear, kind of ex ante. So on the one hand, prioritizing undocumented immigrants with criminal records for deportation could reduce crime through incapacitation and deterrence. On the other hand, there's an opposing concern that when you increase immigration enforcement, you degrade trust in law enforcement in immigrant communities. And law enforcement relies on victims and witnesses to report crimes so that they can detect crimes and also to cooperate in investigations. Without these inputs, the likelihood of being apprehended for a crime can actually go down because fewer crimes are reported. And that could potentially actually perversely increase crime. As a preview of the results, this is the channel that we find in the paper. So there's ambiguous effects of immigration enforcement on public safety. Law enforcement leaders have noted this dynamic. So this is a quote from the former chief of the LAPD and the NYPD, Bill Bratton. He says, every day our effectiveness is diminished because immigrants living and working in our communities are afraid to have any contact with the police. My officers can't prevent or solve crimes if victims or witnesses are unwilling to talk to us because of fear of being deported. And we can't solve crimes that aren't reported because victims are afraid to come forward to the police. Okay, so we have two research questions in this paper. The first is, what is the impact of immigration enforcement on crime? The second one is, what is the impact of immigration enforcement on crime reporting behavior, or the likelihood that a crime is reported to police? There are multiple challenges to answering these questions empirically. So the first one is kind of a standard one when we're doing any sort of causal evaluation, which is that immigration enforcement is non-random and it could be a function of local crime conditions. So we need some quasi-experimental policy variation to approach this problem. The second challenge is that in the real world, when we look at administrative crime resource databases, we only see crimes that are reported. And so because we're thinking about both effects on potential crime reporting and also on underlying crime, we need a data source that can capture crimes that aren't reported to police. And then the last concern is that most administrative data sets, they don't disaggregate crimes by victim characteristics. And here we're going to be really focused on the Hispanic population because that's where the majority of immigration enforcement actions take place and or are against. And so we really need to see victim ethnicity in order to investigate this problem. So in our project, we're going to overcome these challenges first by using restricted census data from the National Crime Victimization Survey. This is a survey that's nationally representative, conducted by the Census and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And it asks people about their crime victimization experiences. So we're going to use two key questions in that survey. The first one is whether a person's been a respondent has been a victim of a crime. And then the second one is, if so, whether they chose to report it. Notably, in the United States, average reporting rates are about 30%. And so there are a lot of unreported crimes. These are going to focus on serious crimes as well, or crimes that have victims. And then the other key thing about this survey is it includes respondent demographics, so we can estimate the effects separately for Hispanic and non-Hispanic respondents. Yet at the causal impact of immigration enforcement, we're going to use the staggered county level introduction of the Secure Communities program. This was an information technology innovation, which allowed fingerprints to be shared through local jails to the Department of Homeland Security, and it reduced barriers to identifying unauthorized immigrants. I'll talk more about the program in a few slides. And it increased immigration detention and deportations at the county level as it was rolled out. Okay, so a preview of the results. We find a significant increase in the victimization of Hispanic individuals after Secure Communities and implementation. We also find that this is coupled with a decline in the reporting rate of crimes for Hispanic victims. If we were to put these together and look at a reported crime rate, similar to what we find in administrative data, the likelihood that you were victimized and reported the crime, we would find no effect because it masks these competing and opposing channels on victimization and reporting. We find no impact of immigration enforcement on non-Hispanics on average. And we are going to argue at the end, I'll argue at the end of the talk, that the decline in reporting is likely the main driver of the increased victimization that we observe. Okay, so this is related to multiple strains of literature. The first is that there's some mixed evidence on the impact of immigration enforcement on public safety. And this literature has used reported crime rates. particular, some of this literature has looked at secure communities. There they found null effects. And that's very consistent with our finding to the analogous reported crime rate that we construct in this paper, where we also find null effects. A separate literature has looked at chilling effects of immigration enforcement on trust in the government and also participation in other kind of public programs. So consistent with our decline in crime reporting, so the reluctance to report crimes to police, there's also been work that shows that increased immigration enforcement reduces participation in SNAP, SSI, Medicaid, also reduces labor force participation. And so there's a large work on these kind of chilling effects. There's also a couple of papers, including one by co-author on this paper, that shows that when there are policy changes that increase trust in law enforcement, crime reporting seems to go up. Separately, there's work on events and policies that shift trust in police and their impacts on crime reporting. And so we think of our papers relating there as well. And then lastly, the findings of this paper kind of underscore the importance of measuring crime well and considering reporting behavior when you measure crime, as well as thinking about effects for subgroups that could be masked in aggregate crime data.
Emily,
Yeah.
ask a question right here.
Yeah.
Before you kind of launch into the different policies. Is some of the heterogeneity in results just due to immigration enforcement can mean many different things, right? Like you're talking about a specific policy that's one type of immigration enforcement. But I mean, there's so many different kinds of policies, right?
Yeah.
So these papers are studying, like a wide range of them.
I would say that the literature on the link between immigration, so thinking about like changes in the number of migrants and crime, is much larger than the literature on immigration enforcement and crime. There's not that much work on that. So we contribute there. And in that space, these are kind of the papers that are on a similar policy as ours, but using the reported crime outcome. And then there's some other papers on a couple of other policies. This one's in Europe, but the literature is a little bit thin. But for sure, the particular characteristics of the policy could give you kind of different. Okay, so we start out with the data. Oh, let's see, data and the empirical strategy. So just to give some background, here on local immigration enforcement, because a lot of times when we think about immigration enforcement, we think about the border, and this paper is about interior enforcement. Increasingly over the last couple of decades, local and state authorities have become more involved in federal immigration enforcement. And the biggest expansion is the policy that we studied, which began in 2008. And so what happened was, historically in local jails, fingerprints were forwarded of any arrestee were forwarded to the FBI. After the introduction of secure communities, those fingerprints were automatically forwarded to DHS and to ICE. And the fingerprints were automatically matched to prior border crossings, overstayed visas, prior arrests, and other immigration documentation, which allowed DHS to very easily flag a person who they thought of as unauthorized or undocumented. And then ICE could issue a detainer request asking the local jail to hold the individual until they could be transferred to ICE. Okay, so this is kind of like a technological innovation. It doesn't change anything that has to happen at the local jails in terms of the way that the police are interacting with people, but it is going to increase immigration enforcement as it's rolled out at the county level. And in fact, it's the largest expansion of local involvement in immigration enforcement that we've seen in recent decades. Okay, so this program was rolled out gradually between 2008 and 2013. And the reason it was staggered was because of technological challenges and resource bottlenecks. The order of the rollout was decided by the federal government, not by counties. And the entire country was eventually treated by 2013. Since then, it's been sort of relaxed and then reinstated a few times. Our analysis is going to focus on the initial rollout of the program. So prior work has shown that earlier activation is not correlated with crime rates. Instead, it appears to be correlated with proximity to the border, presence of sort of more historical 287G agreement, which is a local agreement between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities, and the percent of the Hispanic population. And there's several papers that look at secure communities. So we're sort of building off of that. We also confirm that when we look at treatment timing, that local crime rates are not predicting the rollout. Okay, we're going to focus most of our analysis on Hispanic respondents versus non-Hispanic respondents. It's not the case that all immigrants are Hispanic, but it is the case that over 90% of detainer requests involve Hispanic immigrants, and most of deportation or immigration enforcement actions, like the vast majority, is going to focus on the Hispanic population. Also, just want to note here that some of the other work on chilling finds effects among Hispanic persons who are also citizens. And this is partially because there are so many mixed status households in the United States. So we shouldn't expect that chilling effects are going to be solely focused on non-citizens. Okay, if we just look at, this is kind of a picture of the rollout. This is at the end of each year. You can see that the program begins at the border and other places in the interior, and then eventually is going to cover the entire US. Okay, so before I move on, I just want to sort of insert some background on why we think that victims may respond to this program. So this is more, yeah.
Sorry, Emily, going back to the previous slide.
Yep.
Not that it necessarily mattered, but is there a logic to the rollout that was like given by DHS? Was there an algorithm for where they moved first or anything?
Not that we know of. I mean, the initial rollout seems to be at the border and at places that they already had relationships with counties. And then I don't know much that says definitively how it occurred beyond that. Lipe, do you know anything? We haven't come across anything that says what their explicit decisions are. Okay, yeah. I mean, it may have been in larger counties first. We restrict to large counties. I don't know.
Also, it's all done within the discretion of the executive branch. So they didn't
Yeah.
publicize these things. Like
Yeah.
We know the roles of public records requests.
Yeah.
You can see it from there, and you can infer from regressions of where they did it first. But they don't officially announce why they did in some cases.
Yeah.
But we should interpret them as an average friendlier to DHS or friendlier to ICE than or not.
I don't think so, because this is like I think in the very beginning, but then they're rolling out across the country, and we interpret this as quasi-random.
There's a subset of places that already had agreements with DHS prior to the policy, but that's a very, very small.
Like 50 counties.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so just for background, why might victims respond by reporting crime less? Like, we know that the people who are actually at risk of deportation action are those who are having their fingerprints taken at jail after an arrest. But this program could increase the perception of risk of just talking to law enforcement for a couple of different reasons. So one is that some arrests are for minor incidents. And in fact, if you look at the ICE data that we have from public records requests, 20% of transfers to ICE custody were for individuals who were not charged or convicted of a crime. If you look at survey evidence around this time from 2012, and this 44% of Latinos in this particular survey, which included 70% was the rate for undocumented in the survey, and 28% of US born Latinos said that they were less likely to contact the police if they were a victim of a crime because they feared police would inquire about their immigration status or that of the people that they know. So there is a lot of fear among victims rather than just among people who may be considering offending about immigration enforcement. And this is something that has been raised by police chiefs. So I started off this presentation with that, but just want to note that one of the reasons for this concern is that the local police have really limited authority to protect immigrant victims or witnesses from federal immigration agents. So for example, there's this program that's intended to protect victims of violent crimes called the U Visa program. And it's very small and has a really large backlog and is essentially not available to most people. Yeah.
And so how was the policy announced at the county level? So my question is, do you think they realize that more people are getting deported, or do you think it's an announcement effect of the policy?
So I don't think it's an announcement effect. This was not something that was publicized. I think that this is happening, learning about people who are in immigration enforcement actions. Okay, so just to fix ideas, I'm going to present a simple conceptual framework. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just curious, like, I mean, it also isn't the case that the jails have like a lot of control over this, like whether they're participating. So like in that way, it seems like there's quite a bit of opportunity.
So not in this time period that we're looking at. So the later on, there's what we've heard of as sanctuary city, which is essentially jails opting out of this program. Even when you opt out, though, it's not opting out of this automatic fingerprint sending. What an opt-out looks like with a sanctuary cities policy, which started happening in 2013, kind of after our sample window, is releasing someone before ICE shows up. So it's never the case that they are opting out of this like program.
But the risk is actually being deported, like not your, like these, nobody knows about their fingerprint being off for the reason you just described.
Exactly.
And they really just know about being deported.
Exactly.
And so I'm just, yeah, it seems like the counties can respond by not handing people to ICE.
Yes, and that's what happens with like a lag later on in the lifetime of this policy in some places. Okay, so we're going to think about two different groups for simplification. Both groups are going to be unauthorized immigrants in this model. So potential offenders are going to choose whether to offend. They have a value of crime and an opportunity cost of crime that has a distribution, GC. They face a probability of apprehension, which is the likelihood that a crime is reported times the likelihood that they're arrested for the reported crime. There's a cost of apprehension that's standard for any offender. Plus, there is a different cost related to immigration enforcement, which is the probability of being referred to immigration enforcement times unexpected deportation cost. And this gives kind of an offending rate of this value. On the other side, we have potential victims, and they're going to choose whether or not to report crimes. So they have a benefit of reporting, they have a hassle cost with a distribution FH, and their potential risk of being referred to ICE has a probability of delta times PD. So this allows that risk of immigration action to be lower than for the offenders. if this is between 0 and 1, and they have an expected deportation cost that's the same of T. And so the reporting rate is gonna be this value. If we just think of, if we just take partial derivatives here, we can see that if we increase the probability of referring someone to immigration agents, or the increased likelihood of deportation, we are going to get a decline in reporting by victims. On the other hand, there's this ambiguous effect that occurs for offending. So on the one hand, reporting has gone down. And because of that, the likelihood of being apprehended for any crime has also gone down, which is going to increase offending. But there's also this additional deterrence effect, which could decrease offending. So the impact on offending is ambiguous. And then just to note, the reported crime rate, because it's the product of these things, is also ambiguous. And importantly, if you look at the crime rate, okay, so reported crime rates in administrative data, that's not necessarily going to tell you what's going on with the offending rate. Okay, so for our data sources, we are going to combine two primary sources. One is information from open records requests that have been compiled by Syracuse University on ICE detentions and secure communities removals. So this is a cool database that gives us information on how these immigration enforcement actions are changing at the local level.
This is for the universe of records, or just one state, or just for?
And this is for the country. It has some limitations, but it is records for the whole country over time. And then we're going to use this restricted census data from the National Crime Victimization Survey. Importantly, the restricted version of this survey includes the respondents' county of residence, which allows us to look at the local variation in the rollout. It's nationally representative with 240,000 people per year. The survey is retrospective. There are 7 interviews over 3.5 years. A person's asked about their victimization history in the prior 6 months. We're going to use that to construct a person by month data set. In terms of sample restrictions, in our baseline sample, we exclude border counties because they had that earliest selected activation. And there were 3 states that resisted the policy: Massachusetts, Illinois, and New York. Kind of related to the question before. We exclude these. It turns out not to matter on whether they're included or not. We're going to look at large counties with greater than 100,000 population in 2000. Okay, so to start, I want to show you what the outcomes look like in the raw data, which I always, if there's something in the raw data, that's always helpful in telling a story. This is the quarter is centered around the activation of the policy, looking at Hispanic versus non-Hispanic respondents. And you can see that the victimization of Hispanic respondents is increasing after the policy is rolled out. And the other key result is that the reporting of Hispanic victims is going down after the policy. Yeah.
Just really quickly,
Yeah.
are victims actually being referred to ICE?
So we don't have great quantitative evidence on that point. We know from kind of the survey evidence that I referenced before, we have good reason to believe that they may perceive a risk. We don't have good statistics on whether that's actually happening.
Is it part of like the protocol that they're supposed to be referred to ICE by, or no?
There's no official protocol that we're aware of.
Can you explain this drastic decline in the victimization rate in the end of this?
No, I mean, I believe that this is a bookended, right? Is this a bookended sum? No, it's not.
It's just that.
It's just that yeah, we don't have a strong
reason for that?
We're gonna look at 2-year post-policy outcomes for most of our estimates. Yeah,
What is victimization rate?
victimization rate is it's the likelihood that a respondent is victimized.
How about that? Is that?
So this is this is percentage points.
Oh,
So victimization rates are quite low in the United States. It's about 1%. So that's another thing we do this to make the numbers easier to read, but it also can sometimes be confusing. You should think about the left-hand axis as always being out of 100, not out of 1.
and what types of, can you remind us what types? Sorry.
So there are crimes that have victims. So there's serious violent crimes, excluding, because this is a survey, so. Which is upsetting, but that's why it's excluded. And this one is, we're thinking about for every crime incident, was it reported to police? And there, kind of the average is about 30. Could you just tell us what's the denominator? So the denominator here is all respondents. The denominator here is all.
So it's Hispanic victims over
Overall Hispanic respondents.
overall.
Yeah. This is within group. And then this is reporting among all incidents with Hispanic victims. Okay, if we look at the kind of analogous outcome to reported crime rates we'd see in administrative data, that's the likelihood that a person was victimized and reported to police. So this is reported crimes over all respondents. And here we see a completely flat result. And that's because we have these opposing effects where reporting is going down and victimization is increasing. And that's consistent with the prior work on this policy that showed that immigration enforcement has no impact on crime. Okay, so in terms of our empirical strategy, we're going to use the differential timing of the rollout in an adapted difference in difference model. So we're going to do 2 different versions, one event study at the quarterly level, and one that shows the 2-year post effect. We're always going to be looking separately at Hispanics and non-Hispanics in 2 different samples, and we're going to cluster our errors at the county level. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's this growing literature on potential issues with difference in difference. In particular, a lot of that literature focuses on concerns that can arise when you're using our already treated units as control groups. This is a problem in our setting, right? And also with dynamic treatment effects. We have all units treated in this policy ultimately by 2013, and some prior work has shown some dynamic treatment effects. And so given this setting, we're going to use the Sun and Abraham model, which basically is going to compare early treated counties to later treated counties. The cutoff that we will use is August 2011. So after that, you're in the control group. Want to note, and you'll see this later, that the results that we have are actually very robust to just standard 2-way fixed effects, and also to several of these other strategies that are kind of in our robust extracts. But we're going to, just to make sure we're addressing these concerns, we're going to focus on the Sun and Abraham model as our baseline specification. And so this is going to restrict our time frame from October 2000, or for counties activation dates between October 2008 and August 2011. Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you describe the data, you mentioned that the data was collected retrospectively in the survey. So is it possible that some respondents are contributing at the same time event prior to being treated and at the same time to at some point being treated? Say that somebody reported 6 months prior, but 6 months ago, in the day they have their rollout had not occurred, and the rollout occurs, say at month 3 or 4, they will still report that because they can effectively. So those reported events, some of them belong to the untreated period, and some of them will belong to the treated period.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you are splitting up those sort of events.
We are splitting up our treatment based on treatment timing, which means because it's retrospectively that the same survey could have observations going to pre and post treatment for a county. We have some robustness checks related to our attrition analysis that restricts on people who report before and after, which is exactly that population. We find the same point estimates for that smaller group. For sort of the people who are included before and after the policy
But
change.
the second point, sorry, agree with you, the second point, it seems to me that you also, at the end of the day, are studying a relatively selective sample in the sense that conditional on not being deported yet, this is the information that it sort of provides. Because somebody could be reporting, say, in January, the prior 6 months, and that individual is deported a month later. So that individual will not be cut off in the following survey, for example. So conditional on not being deported at that point, that's what the individual is being reported. Because if you have to conduct the survey a month later and that individual is already reported in the next month, you will not be capturing that individual. So
Well, yeah, so one of the things that we're gonna do, so we haven't thought about attrition in that particular lens. However, we do spend a lot of time thinking about selected attrition and how it could affect the estimates. And so I will show those results in a few slides. The main concern that we've been thinking about when we think about attrition is that people who are leaving the survey are the ones who are least likely to be victimized. Because that would mechanically inflate our victimization effect. So I'll show that in a few slides, but that's definitely something we can think about a little bit more. Yeah,
Maybe I missed it, do you have the immigration status of your respondents?
we do not.
But how likely do you think that undocumented immigrant would answer such a survey? Because this would answer this question, right? If you think that most of your sample is actually either like non-immigrant or legal immigrant, then there is no issue of attrition by deportation.
Yeah, so that's definitely something we could try and do some like back of the envelope estimates to try and think about. I will say that we do some analyses where we're looking at neighborhoods with high shares of non-citizen Hispanics, and we find very similar results to our baseline sample. And so that's kind of sort of like, we don't know what the underlying share of non-citizens in the survey is, but we do some sub-splitting by neighborhood where the respondent is. Okay, so the identifying assumption of our baseline model is that individuals of a given ethnicity, say Hispanic, and earlier treated counties would have trended similar to those later treated counties in the absence of the program. I already talked about kind of the timing of the rollout. We're going to show you kind of the event study coefficients to show that there's no visible pre-trends. And we're also going to assume that there's no contemporaneous shocks associated with the activation of the program. Okay, so in terms of the treatment dates, this is where this is our control group and this is the treatment group. Okay, so main results. First, let's start with kind of a first stage. So this is a measure of the first stage. It's the number of, or it's the log of the number of people who are transferred from detention to ICE. And that increases by 54% after secure communities. If you look at the victimization effect, first showing the effects for the non-Hispanic group, there's no impact of the policy. But for Hispanics, there's a 0.152 percentage point increase. This is the 2-year post-period effect, which corresponds to a 16% increase in the likelihood of victimization for Hispanic respondents. For reporting, again, there is a flat relationship for non-Hispanic victims. For Hispanic victims, there is a 9.5% percentage point decline in reporting, which is a 30% decline in the likelihood of reporting of victimization to the police after the program. And then, as I mentioned before, which you saw in the raw data, if we were to look at a reported crime measure, so this is victimized and reported in the NCBS, we find a precise null for both groups. And that's again consistent with the prior work. Okay, so another thing that's cool about this data set that I want to highlight is that there's kind of two flaws in administrative data. One is that you can't look at the unreported crimes, which we've already talked about. The other one, though, is that you can't really split by victim demographics. And so even if you could split by kind of the reporting of crime, you would end up, and you couldn't look at victim demographics, you would end up with this final row, which is the total respondents. And because Hispanics are approximately 20% of the overall population, you still would not be able to detect effects. So this is another really important feature of the survey. And so the effects would be muted if we looked at the pooled, but the pooled total is also quite interesting because it tells us that among the total population, we can rule out declines in victimization from this policy of greater than 3.3%. That even when we look right here, right, that the total victimization in the entire population is not going down. Yeah.
Do you think it would take more time for the effect on non-Hispanic to kick in? So because maybe those people who got deported would have stayed in prison otherwise. And so then they would not have committed a crime either way, either by staying in prison or being deported. So it's really a more long-term thing.
Potentially, we could look at the long-term coefficients, which we have not released as part of this project. I think that they are similar to the main ones, but we don't have those that as released. I think when I think about this policy, and this is not universally true, and this comes up in the neighborhood effects. The US is fairly segregated, and the reporting effects that we expect are going to be among Hispanic victims. And so I'm not sure kind of how much action we should expect on the non-Hispanic victims, just generally.
So you mean the one deported would have committed a crime on Hispanic
Exactly.
anytime?
Yeah.
Do you know who committed the crime?
So, okay, I'm gonna get to that later on. We don't have the best information on that, but we're gonna try and do the best we can with some external data. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What's the relationship between reported crime rates and like the ground truth crime? You mentioned now some external data, but is there like, what's the validity of reported versus actual crime rates?
So about 30, we know from, this is the survey that we have to look at reported versus reported crime. We know that 30% of crimes are reported on average. The NCBS is validated, can only be validated among the reported crimes, right? Because police never know when a crime is not reported. And it actually tracks quite well with kind of FBI data on reported crime. If you look at those two measures across the two sources. So, and your question is how well the two correlate with one another?
Like reported,
I think that
survey reported versus reported to the business.
So the kind of one of the punchlines of this paper is that if you look at reported crime, you're not necessarily going to get the full story of what's happening to unreported crime. So that's one way. Now, there might be other policies where the two things are going to track together, but one of like the punchlines of the research is that we really do need to look at unreported crimes as well as reported crimes to get a sense of total public safety. Okay, yes.
How should we think about people moving, like in response to security?
So there is work on migration responses to secure communities. There's work on a lot of different secondary effects to secure communities, including labor markets and other things that we think could affect crime. And so at the end of the talk, hopefully I'll have time, I'm gonna talk about weighing all those alternative effects in research and I'll try to argue that reporting is the main channel. So we do an explicit analysis of that. In terms of robustness of our main effects, we consider different sample periods and sample specifications and find very stable results. We also add controls for individual covariates, county unemployment, because the recession's happening at the same time. And we include robustness checks related to some alternative strategies, including standard difference in difference, as well as the other adapted models of Brusiak et al. And Calway and Santana. The results are likewise robust for the non-Hispanic group of basically a precise 0. So one of the big concerns with the estimates could potentially be that there's selected sample attrition, and this is something that we've thought a fair amount about. So here the concern is like, okay, maybe there's a chilling effect in response to the survey. And in particular, we're concerned that the people who are selectively leaving are not those who would be victimized, okay, which could mechanically inflate our victimization effect. We can only see, and so in the NCVS, we can see all of the addresses that were contracted for a survey, but we can only see their demographics if they responded. So we're going to use address level data and household level data to conduct an attrition analysis. So the way we think about this is we look at all households and then different households and census tracts that have increasingly Hispanic shares of residents. We find no significant effects on attrition for the policy introduction. But we also do this kind of like back of the envelope calculation where we consider basically that all of the people who attrited were Hispanic, which is a very conservative assumption, and that none of them were victims. And then we say, okay, how much of the victimization effect that we observe would be explained by this worst case scenario, even though we have insignificant effects. And it's at most 25% of the effects that we observe, which leads us to believe that it's very unlikely that selective attrition is what's driving our victimization effect that we observe. We also have some evidence using kind of always responders and individual fixed effects using the panel design and find stable coefficients there as well. One of the other things that we do is we think about victim composition. So even if total response isn't declining, perhaps who's responding is changing. And so we take the respondent sample in the pretreatment period, and we predict victimization based on covariates. We get a predicted victimization outcome, and we put that on the left-hand side of our regressions. The idea here is that if what's changing in response to the policy is the respondent characteristics, and that's what's driving our victimization effect, we should see predicted victimization increase. And we don't find that. We find null impacts on predicted victimization. And this leads us to believe that the policy is unlikely to be changing the respondent composition in the sample. Related to that, there's kind of a different concern that's going to use an almost identical test, that the policy changed who was victimized relative to pretreatment and what types of crimes occurred. And in particular, if the new crimes that occur after secure communities have different rates of reporting, you could get a mechanical decline in reporting just based on a compositional change in victims or crimes. And so we're going to do the same thing in the crime incident sample, predict the likelihood of reporting using pre-treatment data and covariates. And if this compositional channel is happening, we should expect to see significant declines in these predicted reporting outcomes. We do see some small declines, but they're about 10% of the total reporting decline that we observe. So we don't think that this is the primary channel for the reporting decline that we see. Okay. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I will just press on. Okay, great. Okay, so we do a bunch of other analyses in the paper. We look at how the impacts vary by crime type. We find stronger effects for property crimes versus violent crimes. We can't reject that the coefficients have different sizes. There's many fewer violent victimization incidents in the sample, so that leads to lower precision. For gender, we find some interesting results. The reporting declines are largely similar across men and women, but the victimization increase is a female victim effect. So they're the ones that are bearing the cost of this policy. We also look at county variation in treatment effects. And we find bigger victimization effects in counties that have more non-Hispanic, more non-citizen Hispanics, or larger non-citizen Hispanic share. And then lastly, we look across neighborhoods using census tract data. And we find that an interesting result where, Hispanic victimization and reporting doesn't really vary by neighborhood, but for non-Hispanics, there is an increased likelihood of victimization and a decreased likelihood of reporting in very Hispanic or non-citizen Hispanic neighborhoods. And this sort of supports a story that perhaps potential offenders are targeting areas where the probability of apprehension has declined. Okay, yeah.
So I don't know enough about police budgets and how they shift sort of priorities, but the main treatment period in your sample was Great Recession timing, and you sort of invented various different things that police departments might be cutting costs by cutting Spanish translators, cutting boots on the ground officers in Hispanic neighborhoods that may be kind of giving some effects that you're maybe picking up that would be related to their budgetary problems. I mean, thoughts?
So that's a great question. This is definitely happening during the Great Recession. So for that to violate kind of our identification assumption, it would have to be the case that those cutbacks are correlated with the program rollout, which is happening over a fast period and seems to be quasi-random, dictated by the federal government. So we don't think that that's happening. However, to address this concern about the local effects of the recession, we have a robustness check where we control for county level unemployment over time, and it does not change the results. But that's a great question.
So
Yeah.
I have one question here.
Not
Yeah,
saying-
no worries. So on the last point, I guess I kind of would have expected probably the opposite. So this is basically saying that white people are more victimized in more Hispanic neighborhoods, where I guess chances are the offender is more likely to be Hispanic as well, right? I based on your model, I guess I would have expected that we would see less Hispanic on white crime because there's no trade-off, right? There's just more of a risk of being apprehended and being sent to ICE, right? But there's no upside to it. And at the same time, if we flip it around, I guess I would have expected to see more white or Hispanic crime because again, there's the chance that they won't report it, but I don't have anything more to fear. So yeah, I guess that would have led
So
me
your
to.
intuition is great, and I'm gonna get there in a second with a offender race. That's excellent intuition. I would just say that the way we're thinking about this is the probability of apprehension, or sort of my decreased chance of getting caught for a crime, is going to be a function of where the victims are, who are reporting less. And so that's why we think that the non-Hispanic people who are living in Hispanic neighborhoods also have higher victimization likelihood. And then there's also this interesting thing that's happening where non-Hispanics who live in Hispanic neighborhoods are reporting less. Perhaps that's out of concerns for their neighbors as well, where they don't want to interact with the police as much just by virtue of living in a very highly Hispanic.
And so here just the comparison is it's higher victimization compared to Hispanics in Hispanic neighborhoods.
No, it's always
or
just
non-Hispanic?
non-Hispanics, non-Hispanic and non-Hispanic neighborhoods, yeah.
And Emily,
Yeah.
could it be also that non-Hispanic living in Hispanic neighborhoods are more likely than other non-Hispanic to be illegal immigrant of other origin?
It could be.
So it could
be,
be,
yeah.
I mean, you're focusing on
Yeah.
Hispanic, but you say they're not the only immigrants, right?
That's
So it could be
definitely
like
could be, yes.
Hispanic on non-Hispanic illegal immigrants.
Yes, that could be happening as well. That's a great point.
Or have mixed households.
Yeah, or mixed households as well. Yeah, more likely to be in mixed households. Okay, so this is actually the next slide. I didn't really, I just put this in last night, so, or yesterday afternoon. So the NCVS unfortunately has limited information on offenders. And this is for a couple of reasons. One is, there only about 10% of victims in the survey report that they know who the offender was. So from them, we can't really get that much. And then also, offender ethnicity was not a question in the survey until after our sample period. So one of the things we do is we just look at the likelihood of arrest in the NCVS because we're interested in how kind of ultimately the probability of apprehension changes. We find a large decline in total kind of victimization or total arrests that's similar among all respondents. That's similar to our decline in reporting. So it does look like the likelihood of being arrested is going down, but this is imprecise, and so it's a large effect, but because this is a rare outcome, we don't have a lot of precision there. Another thing that we do that we recently added to the paper is we have a large data collection of police administrative data that we've been working on for a couple of years for multiple projects. Some of the RAs are in this room, which is wonderful. We take 82 large city police departments for which we have micro data on 911 calls and arrests for the sample period that we're looking at. So this is a large hand collected data set that comes from public records requests to police departments. And we look at Hispanic versus non-Hispanic tracks, looking at the top quartile of Hispanic share in the census tract. There we find no change in the total volume of arrests or calls. This is consistent with our null reported crime effect. We can look at the Hispanic share of arrestees to try and think about kind of how is the race composition of arrestees changing with the policy. And we find a decline in the Hispanic share of arrestees. And so this is exactly consistent with the intuition from before, which is that, you know, the Hispanic arrestees potentially face this deterrent effect related to immigration enforcement. And they also they're facing this decline in probability of apprehension, which could increase offending. But for non-Hispanics, they don't face that deterrent effect of increased immigration enforcement. And so from the results, we can sort of intuit that the marginal arrestees are more likely to be non-Hispanic after the policy. Okay. So this is preliminary. So any comments, we're definitely interested in comments on that analysis. If you have thoughts. So earlier I mentioned the fact that Secure Communities has effects on lots of different outcomes. And we want to consider those in relation to our main reporting channel that we're arguing is driving our effects. So far, we have kind of two key results. One is that secure communities increased Hispanic victimization, and it decreased Hispanic crime reporting. And we want to know, are these effects linked? And I've sort of been talking about this channel throughout the talk, that offender behavior depends on the probability of apprehension. Reporting goes down, that probability of apprehension is also going down. We can look at this kind of descriptively in the data and find some really reassuring evidence of this relationship. Basically, we estimate the effects separately by cohort of implementation of the program, so month and year. And we find that the places that had large decreases in reporting also had larger increases in victimization. And the elasticities here are actually kind of large. So their baseline estimate elasticity is negative 0.52. If you look at just the slope of this line, it's actually negative 0.65. And the correlation between these two outcomes is about negative 0.5. And then we also do this with county-specific estimates and estimate a correlation between those two, considering error in the estimates, and we get a correlation of negative 0.3, but there the estimates are less precise. Okay, so that's kind of descriptive evidence of these being linked. We know from other research that there are other demographic and economic changes that happen within the Hispanic community. So we know, for example, that labor market outcomes changed in response to this policy. So we want to think about whether the relative importance of those changes from secure communities to the change in crime reporting. So we're going to do a mediation analysis, and the idea here is to think about, to estimate effects of secure communities on these other outcomes. And then we're going to use elasticities from the literature on the impact of, let's say, unemployment on crime to try and quantify the relative importance of these different channels. And so this follows the framework in Heckman et al. 2013. The idea here is that the predicted difference in victimization is the impact of changes that secure community had on different intermediate effects or mediators times the effect of that mediator on crime. And so we are going to estimate these impacts of secure communities on each mediator that we consider, and we're going to take our alphas or our impacts of those mediators on crime from prior work. So the different things we're going to consider are the impact of crime reporting on crime. That's from this paper. We're also going to use the American Community Survey to estimate the effect of secure communities on the employment to population ratio as our measure of unemployment, hourly wages, and the population share of low educated foreign-born Hispanics. This is following work by East et al. And we're also going to look at changes in the share of households, of Hispanic households that are headed by women, because we know that the migration that occurred was more male, and there's sort of some older work that suggests that maybe female-headed households could be more at risk of becoming victims.
Emily?
Yeah.
Could you just comment for a moment? This is an interdisciplinary audience. What's the advantage of using this framework versus a standard mediation analysis? What kind of drove you to that decision?
So, well, one was we were concerned about the timing points of the outcomes because of the staggered rollout. So it wasn't as like in the Heckman paper, it's sort of like an RCT and everything's happening at the same time. And so it's more of a cross-sectional difference. One of the things I think is nice about this, we we could do it the other way as well, is that these elasticities we're taking, are kind of from separate analyses that use different IV strategies on these channels and crime, which is nice because we don't have to worry about omitted variable bias in the same way, I think. So that's another thing that's attractive here. We could try and do it the other way as well. I don't know if I missed any strengths.
I think one of the main, so the main way we're deviating from the standard mediation analysis is just we're not using our data to estimate the effect of these intermediate things on victimization.
Yes.
One of the issues, we think one of the main effects is coming from reduced reporting, but that's measured with a lot of error in our data. So if you put that on the right-hand side, you're just going to conclude that it has no effect on victimization. So we figured it made more sense to rely on estimates from the rest.
Okay, so we're gonna use these papers for the estimates of those mediators on crime rates. Okay, so this is what we find. So the way to read this kind of chart is the green bar is our actual effect in percentage points. And each of these alternative bars is going to use, sorry about that. Use our estimates of the impact of secure communities on the mediators and these literature elasticities to say how much would we predict crime to go up based on those estimates and these different factors. You can see that these other mediators that we are using are quite small. And the victim reporting effect is even larger than what we observe. And part of that is because there's not a whole lot of work on victim reporting and crime, but the work that does exist has like huge elasticities, and our victimization effect is quite large. We use a really conservative estimate from that literature, and still we find something that's kind of double the effect size of our estimate. This gives us a negative residual for the unmeasured factors that aren't in this analysis. And this is also kind of interesting. It's suggestive, but it sort of indicates that there could be this other competing channel of deterrence that's going on at the same time. Because we do have an increased probability of deportation that's resulting from the policy.
So can you just?
Yeah.
Because this is an interdisciplinary audience.
Yes.
We're talking about elasticities, which I think resonate
Okay,
only
fair
with
enough.
one discipline.
Fair
So
enough.
is there a way you can interpret that a little bit more for the rest of our?
So, these are actually converted from elasticities, but when we think of elasticities, it's just how much does a particular outcome change in percentage terms when another outcome changes by 1%. And that's kind of nice because it allows us to convert different policy effects of different magnitudes from other papers into kind of a uniform metric. And we use that to estimate these effects. Okay.
Right, Emily,
Yeah,
before you get to
go
the conclusion, that
Yeah.
residual part is pretty interesting, right? When you
Yeah.
go back to your theoretical model, that
Yeah.
deterrence part
Yeah.
was kind of a key thing to put the science, right?
Yeah.
I'm just curious if there's a way to think about some of the county variation in information, like how much this was talked about in newspapers, how much people really realized what was going on,
Yeah.
right? If there was increased victimization, or if there was like really enforcement, where there are lots of raids, where there are lots of busts, stuff like that. Just to get, to like try to identify that a little more. Would be
Yeah.
Really interesting.
So that's a great idea. We have the information on raids isn't great, but it's something that we would love to do future work on. The other thing that's been shown in one prior paper is kind of like a simple Google Trends analysis of salience. Perhaps we could try and replicate that and look at counties based on different kind of estimated salience or something like that. That's a great idea. But yeah, it is really interesting that the residual is negative. Yeah.
But just so this, could you look at newspapers? Like, Factilar, those like huge search tools, like look at headlines, deported immigrants.
Yeah, we could certainly try to, I think, yeah. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. That's a good idea. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I will just wrap up, which is, and then we can keep talking if we have time. We find that expansions of immigration enforcement have actually increased victimization of Hispanic persons, and it reduces the willingness of Hispanic victims to report crime. And we're able to do this with some unique data from the census, and our findings are in contrast to the explicit goals of these policies, which aim to decrease crime by increasing immigration enforcement. We do this decomposition analysis and also show some descriptive evidence with the cohort estimates, which we think supports the idea that reporting is the primary channel for the results that we find for the victimization increase. And we also just want to highlight that our results show the importance of disentangling victimization from crime reporting behavior when you're measuring crime, and also the importance of victim ethnicity behavior in the context of policies that are focused on particular subgroups. And that's all I have. Yeah.